Aaron.
Great. Hi, everyone. I am so thrilled to be here to talk with everybody in regards to this film, Shalom Bollywood. And today we have Danny Ben Moshe, and he's the filmmaker. And we're going to talk a little bit about what he does. We're going to talk about his background and why he made this film. We may also be joined by Rachel Rubin, who is part of the film and the granddaughter of one of the main people that were part of the Bollywood film scene. And just to give you a little bit of background about Danny, he's produced and directed several critically praised documentaries, including My Mother's Lost Children, which was shown during the 2018 JCC Chicago Jewish Film Festival. He also has several other films that are out in regards to China's Artful Dissident, Outback Rabbis, so we may touch upon those as well. So Danny, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity.
The pleasure. And
I was told with lockdown I wouldn't be going anywhere, and here I am in Chicago. How good is that?
You know, it's such an interesting thing that you're here. You're in Australia. I'm here in the Chicagoland area. Right before we started this, I was telling you about how I just got off a presentation I was doing with an organization called the United Nations Association. And it was with, I was talking with somebody in Nairobi, Kenya. And you happened to mention that one of your films was premiered at the United Nations Association program in San Francisco. And it just shows you how small the world is, how much we are connected, and how you don't necessarily know that you're connected until you start to peel that back. And is that somewhat what you found when you started? Like, how did you hear about the story of the Jews in the Indian film industry?
Yeah, you know, we have this notion in the Jewish world, and obviously I'm Jewish. I make a lot of Jewish stories. You've seen your festival had My Mother's Lost Children. I mean, I also make non-Jewish films as well. And, you know, we think we know the Jewish world. And, you know, I'm a Chad and all of that. And I grew up knowing there were Indian Jews because there was an Indian Jewish community in London. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a friend I had an Indian Jewish girlfriend. And I thought, oh, wow, she's really cute. So I always knew, right, that there were Indian Jews. A lot of people don't. And when and that was the kind of, yeah, okay, so there are Indian Jews, right? Where we were sort of, you know, we're everywhere. Like you said, you're there, I'm here. We're telling a story about the Southeast Asian continent. And I used to be an academic. And the way this started was I'd started filming. I made my first documentary. I was still a full-time academic. I'm not an academic at all anymore. I'm a full-time creative. And this was back in 2005, so some time ago now. And I had an Indian PhD student working in the research institutes that I directed. And she got into some complications with her landlords and some legal issues with the university, whatever. And I helped her out. It was really no big deal at all. And her parents, particularly her father, were very appreciative. And apparently this is quite an Indian thing. They sort of send you gifts. And so there would be like a knock on the door, and Devaki would come along and say, oh, this is from my father, or whatever. And they're what we would call schmutzkers, like knickknacks that you don't need, that you don't want. A pen, a key ring, you know, nice gestures, completely unnecessary. And this was kind of going on. And one day there's a knock on my door, and she goes, oh, this is from my father. And it was a piece of paper. So I thought, okay, my recycling bin is strategically located because I really don't. And I kept saying, please don't send anything. And it was 2006 actually. And it was the obituary of Nadira. And I read that, and it was like, and he knew I was Jewish, which is obviously why he sent the thing.
Right.
And it was like, wow, that's like, I find in life so much, you know, we were talking before about what was the impetus for you doing the podcast. So much is the kind of like same and unstimulating, to be quite honest. And that's also the criteria in which a lot of my films about stories that I think stand out and inspire me and hopefully can inspire others as well. And it was like, wow, a Jewish Indian superstar? You're kidding me, right? And I just made my first film and I was hooked and I wanted to make another. And so I managed to get some development funding, because the way filmmaking works is it's often in stages. So, you know, you get a little bit to develop the story, to see if there's a story there, what it might look like, and then that will grow to production, should you be so lucky. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. And managed to get a little bit of money and took myself off to India to see if there was a story about Nadira to be made. And if there was, who would be in it? Who could tell me about it? What would be the scenes? What would be the locations? All that kind of ABC stuff 101 of filmmaking.
Did you even know if there was a Jewish community still there?
Sorry?
Did you even know if there was still a Jewish community there?
Well, the first thing I did, like when you're going to make a film, is it's all about access. It's all about contacts. It's all about networks, as is just about everything in life. But all the more so with filmmaking. So I contacted the Jewish community and I said, hey, I'm looking to come. And they must have thought, oh, wow, another like kind of white tourist sort of thing. And I was told that there was accommodation block, Jewish kind of accommodation in the synagogue compounds, in the Magen David synagogue where you saw Haida go to in the film. It was attached to that. So I thought, fantastic, I'm going to dump myself in the Jewish community, hang out, see where it takes me, see who I find. So I went along, and the first kind of thing was trying to get there from the airport. And I don't know if anyone's been to India, but of course it's another kind of world. I was in culture shock. It was my first time. And no one knew where the synagogue was. And I had a driver, and it was stopping, you know, all sorts of people, and they were explaining, and I kind of, you know, obviously people speak English, Jewish, no idea, right? And then the driver would say like Israel, and no idea, right? Not the foggiest, right? And of course, this is a country, as we show, that's got a lot of gods, right? So the Jewish one doesn't necessarily stand out. And of course, the community, even at its peak, was minuscule. Eventually we find it. Great, I'm there. Very much a sort of kind of backpacker accommodation sort of setup. And then I started to talk to people. And okay, I found out a little bit about Nadira. And then someone said to me, you should really talk to Pramila's son. And I go, who's Pramila? And they go, Pramila, like I should know, you know, like Charlton Heston, I should know, right? And, you know, the actress. And I go, Jewish? Yeah. Okay, I'd love to meet him, right? So I go and I meet Haida, who is the star of the film, I believe, my documentary. And then he says, you know, my mother had a cousin called Rose, you know, her granddaughter is like a big star in India. She's a model. Now she's in film. And I'm going, she had a cousin called Rose? And I go back to the hostel, basically, which it was. And the guy on the desk there says, you know, how was your day? And I go, yeah, it's amazing. I found out about Pramila and about Rose. And he goes, oh, do you know about my uncle? Who's your uncle? David. You're kidding me, right? So what started, and this is really the best films I find, they start in one way and then they grow into something else. Now, of course, it was still the story of Indian Jews and Bollywood, but it grew to something much bigger. And then in the course of time, it grew into that bigger story about interfaith, intercultural, and a story about women, really, and the brutality of an industry where, you know, beauty remains paramount and aging is not necessarily always deemed the most in-demand thing in that industry.
did you expect to find that? Because you know what I saw is in many ways the actors who were so large in fame ended up with a pretty sad story of how their lives turned out at the end. Was that something that you were expecting?
No, I mean, I think you kind of, I mean, obviously, whenever you make any film, you have an idea of, oh, I think it's going to be this. But then you have to be open and allow for it to take its own course. And no, I had no idea. And probably if you would have asked me what would have been the latter years for people who were cinematic greats, no doubt about it, I would have expected, you know, the optimal anyone could want. And it turned out otherwise. So this is not a story with a happy ending in many regards. You know,
Right.
It's one which has had a massive impact on the shape, the destiny, and the timing of the world's biggest film industry. And that this tiny Jewish community had this massive impact is just kind of staggering. I mean, we always have a disproportionate influence in every place we've been and in all walks of life. This one, I think, is just like right out there. But I think it's a story of art imitating life in many respects. Yes. And I've tried to show that in the film, you know, particularly with Nadira, who was this vamp. And, you know, there's only so much you can put in a film. I spent like over 10 years making this film, which is long. It's not kind of unheard of in the documentary world, you know, probably 3 years would be the average life for any of my films. But this one, and because it wasn't funded and blah, 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 it's reasons I won't bore you with. But Nadira, when she got this vamp and she was a great vamp. And then she wanted to have other roles as well. But all the producers and the directors said, hey, you're such a great vamp. You know, you can't be a heroine. And all those kind of stereotype roles of Indian cinema. So she kind of had this role. And really, in latter life, she was drinking terribly. She was propositioning younger men all the time. It was very sad. And here's a little anecdote. Again, so many things that couldn't get into the film, either because they disrupt the story and the sort of flow of the story, or just because of resource issues. You know, every frame, every second costs production time, post-production time, etc., and money. Is she went to Israel to see her family because she had no family in India. And all the Indian Jews were like, wow, this is great. Like Shri in Shri 420 in the 50s was one of the most popular films in Israel. They were queuing round the block, literally. And so she got there. She was already on the bottle, may she rest in peace. And they wanted her to sing and dance her song from Shri 420, which everyone knew. This was in the 80s already. She couldn't remember. So yes, it is sad, but I think, you know, and Ruby Myers, you know, that she died alone. But, you know, I think, you know, one of the things I was told was that with these women who had great beauty, men were scared of them, wouldn't know how to approach them even, right? Which is, you think every guy, right, in India would be like kind of at their feet, but to the contrary, and all that now, and so
they're intimidated.
Sorry,
they were intimidated.
They were intimidated. Absolutely. So Ruby ends up, and then of course, you know, you're flush with funds, and you think it's going to last forever, and it doesn't. And the film industry can be, a brutal industry. I mean, you know, both Nadira, who after her first film earned a lot of money, she got married. This isn't in the documentary. I had in the documentary, she had one short-lived marriage. She married a film lyricist who wanted to be a producer. He produced a film which she acted in. It was a disaster. She lost all her money. Ruby Myers couldn't get parts in films. Solochina couldn't get parts in films anymore. She became a producer disaster. And sometimes there's no way back. And I think, you know, it is, in many respects, it's about the sort of the price of fame, the price of passion. But ultimately, you know, I think on the upside, right to the end, you know, Nadira was being brought every Friday night, Shabbat meals, you know, from the community. And there's solace in that sort of Jewish through line.
They tried to help her. And I know, Rachel, you're here now, and Rachel is the granddaughter of Miss Rose. And you've gone back into the family business, right?
In a sense, yeah. I never wanted to get into the movie acting, but I slipped in behind the scenes.
What made you so crazy?
Really, it's in my DNA. You know, I don't know really. I would not point a through line from my career to my grandmother's career. But somewhere in there was, you know, a lot of exposure to movies and the arts and music, and maybe that's what it was. It was also that my whole, we were brought up by a line of women. I mean, my father always joked that he was the only man ever in the room. And strong women and working women. And so I think that maybe came down to the point where I wanted to be independent, and I fought for it and won it and enjoyed it. And found the niche that I wanted to be. I found in the 80s, Bollywood, the Indian movie business had changed. It had become very chauvinistic. I didn't like the way they portrayed women. I was not comfortable with the idea. So when I did get offered a little bit, I thought, no, this is really not what I want. So I found my own way into movies, but you know, not upfront. And like Danny says, it's a tough business. You have to be extremely prepared. I think those were the salad days when my grandmother was in the movie business. There's a photograph that Haider, who's in the movie, sent us. And it's all a group of actresses, and they're all cousins, mothers, daughters. Almost everybody in that group of about 12 people are all related. So it was a fairly cottage industry at that point, but it still was brutal. It had that whole thing. But as it grew in India, you know, the mafia got involved with it. There was crooked money in it. It got to be very macho. So for those and many other reasons, I decided not to follow in my grandmother's
But you know, hey Rachel,
Hi.
You know, Jews, well, and everyone obviously works in the industry in different ways. I think two things. One, I think we kind of like subconsciously absorb that world around us, you know? Like, my son is making documentaries, like, and he's convinced he would be doing that anyway if it was not for me. But I kind of wonder, you know, you've just seen things, you've heard things, DNA, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I grew up in a home, not of any filmmakers, but by, my dad was obsessed by watching documentaries. That's all that would be on TV all the time, you know? So I reckon we just kind of, we do imbue this kind of stuff. But
absolutely. If I may say, I have a daughter who's 8. She watches me work. And I can't tell you how often she's been like, oh, mommy, that's not a very good edit, is it? You know, she's watching the way images are connected because she's figured out that's what mommy does. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I would chime in too. I mean, I do a podcast, and my kids want to do something too. And my daughter has come with me as I do interviews and is very interested in it. So I think it's what you're around and what you see, and you try to emulate it because that's what it can inspire you, right?
Yeah, of course. And the other point I wanted to make was that, you know, Jews made their contribution in different ways to Indian cinema. In the same way Rachel went behind the camera, you know, there were characters I couldn't go into, but there was a Jewish cinematographer in the early periods. There was in Raj Kapoor's studios a Jewish choreographer called David Herman. Now, you know, so it was really incredible how all over the sort of the Indian cinema show, Jews were playing their role. And I think, you know, we saw that only in a moment. He only had a moment in the film. Joseph David Penkar, the Jewish playwright who wrote Alam Ara, the first talkie. And, you know, Indian cinema really came out of Parsi theatre. And he was a playwright. In fact, Alam Ara, that first movie, was essentially just a filmed version of the play. But he had written, you know, Jewish plays. He'd written one about the Maccabees. He'd written several Jewish kind of stories. So people take their own experience and then, you know, make it manifest in whatever the opportunity there is.
Right. And I think that the story is also, it's not just the story of the Jews of India in film, it's a story of the Jewish diaspora. And, you know, showing that you have Jews all around. And Rachel, your family, they're Iraqi, right?
So there are 3 or 4 waves of the Jews arriving. The oldest was before Christianity even. They talk about the 12 tribes, and one of the tribes apparently ended up on the west coast of India. And they became absorbed allowed by the king to settle as long as they didn't proselytize. But they were so devastated, they only knew 2 things. They knew the Shema, and they knew that the Saturday was, a day of rest. And then the Dutch came later on as traders and found these people and said, but you're Jewish, and built the first synagogue. Oh. Then they came from what they call the Baghdadi Jews, that's originally Spanish descent, escaped the Inquisition, went into the Middle East, came to India as traders. So they came to Calcutta, which is the top center, west central India, northwest central. So there's the coastal Jews, then there's the Kerala Jews, that's a whole nother strain. So there are many little pockets that arrived. But I think going to what Danny said, in terms of the strength of the Jewish community in the arts and in cinema, dwindled, because in 1964, Indira Gandhi had a diplomatic, exchange pact opening borders with Israel. Israel gave us drip agriculture, drip farming, and then all the Jews. I mean, I remember my family gatherings were, 20, 30 people. There were 3 Rachels and 4 Enochs and 5, Rebeccas. And then suddenly, most of the people just took off between, say, mid-60s and the mid-70s. So the numbers, at least in the city where the business was, the people that were left were really the older people, the old generation, and people like my father who had no Zionist aspiration.
And you were there until you moved to New York. Right?
Yeah, until I got married. So one of the things I said to Danny when we met was, I ain't never getting married and all that. Then he caught me 10 years later.
Maybe that's why, like, there was some greater reason why it had to take me 10 years to make the film, just to allow that to happen.
Bookend.
Totally. And in the interim, I see you've become an expert on the history of Indian Jews. If only you knew that at the time.
Right.
But
if I may, having come to New York, people, when they find out that I'm Jewish and I'm Indian, I better have my story.
Well, what is the look on people's face when people ask you about that? They find out that you're an Indian Jew. I've never met an Indian Jew. I've met a lot of people from India.
Yeah, most people haven't. And what Danny said was so true, even within India. I've been asked things like, how do you have a name like Rachel? Is that from the Bible? Yes, it's biblical. Oh, so are you Christian? No, I'm not Christian. I'm Jewish. Oh, that means you're from Israel. No, I'm not from Israel. So even within India, being Jewish was quite a stretch. Most people didn't really even know. It's not something that's in our history books much. In the West, they're amazed. They're amazed at the story of the way, the spread of the diaspora and how far and how wide. They're impressed with the absolute lack of any anti-Semitism in India, the absolute embrace of Jews and Judaism. And they're amazed that somebody who grew up in India is able to, have that history and have the story.
What was it like when you, oh, I'm sorry, Danny, go ahead.
No. I was going to say about, I mean, in many respects, the fact that people in India don't know there are Jews or what Jews are is part of the Shalom Bollywood story. When I was doing my research, and and I would go and I would meet film journalists and I would meet film historians, and all this kind of nitty gritty hard work you got to do to try and find the story. And I would say Nadira, and they would say, oh yeah, she was a Parsi, right, a Zoroastrian. And I go, no, like, she was Jewish. I know she's Jewish, right? I know nothing about Bollywood, and I'm telling you, this Bollywood star, this Indian cinema star, was Jewish. And then I had the same thing, and people would go, really? Pramila? We thought Pramila was Christian, right? No. She's Jewish. Her name was Esther. Esther? And one of the reasons why these Jewish stars, Sulochana was Ruby Myers, yeah? I mean, Myers, that's not a very Indian name, is it? Rose, what was your grandmother's full name? Rachel?
Ezra, but she never used it.
Right. So, and then it became, Rose was one of her names, wasn't it, in there? Right. So she became Miss Rose because, Ezra, Pramila, we've said, Esther, and then David insisted on being called David. And Nadira was Farhat Ezekiel. So they were given Indian names to be accessible to an Indian audience. And that is one reason why this Indian Jewish story is so unknown. And it's incredible, really. I mean, obviously, it's getting known now through my film. But just to give you an example, I was getting on a flight to Israel from Australia. You have to go via somewhere, of course. I was going via Hong Kong. And they had like magazines, Indian Jewish Life, as you board the plane, something to read. And it was like, and on it, this was a few years ago. I hadn't finished my film yet. And it was like Jews in Indian cinema. And I go, great, right? Some research material. Sit down on the plane, I've got like 13 or however many endless hours to go through. And I open it up and it's all quotes from me, right? That is no use to me whatsoever, right? But it's because I'd given a couple of talks and it was an unknown story that I suppose, like this event, people are fascinated by. And there's someone behind you, Rachel, who's probably checking on our editing.
That's the next generation. That would be Rose's great-granddaughter. Great-granddaughter. Oh, you go away. But to go back to what Danny's saying, this is really interesting. So every Jew had taken the local name. So along the coast, which is my father's, which is the Bene Israel, which is the lost Jews, the lost tribe, they call themselves. So they took the name of the land that they were dwelling in. So everybody had a kar. Kar is off. So if the village was Naugao or Pen or Alibag, these are all names of little coastal towns, villages, you became Naugao Kar or Pen Kar. So the Reuben became one of the names, but the last name, which was the business and anything legal or anything, to do with the local municipality, you were a Naugao Kar. That is another reason why a lot of the Jewish names were just not said, not spoken, not heard. And then if all these women changed their names, nobody knew the sound of, a Jewish name or even had an idea.
Well, it's not too different than Hollywood, because so many Jews have changed their name there too, right? So it's a similar thing throughout the world, and it's to be marketable, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Accepted. Yeah.
And just, some of the questions that are coming through here, people are asking about, how what is ritual life as a Jew in India? I mean, are there different forms of like Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, or are there kosher markets and things like that?
Should I take this, Danny? I guess.
I think so.
Okay, so the Jews and the Muslims have always lived as brothers. So the neighborhoods are always Muslim and Jew together. There'll inevitably be a Muslim caretaker of a Jewish synagogue. The Six-Day War, the whole Muslim community surrounded the synagogue, actually physically holding hands with the young men standing on the outside to protect what was a bomb threat. So the Muslims live by the same kosher laws as we do, except it's not, Orthodox. It wouldn't be okay with an Orthodox Jew, but for the average Jew, it's the same kind of meat. It's the halal meat. So the communities kind of came together because I think largely dietary reasons. They had synagogues and mosques, no idol worship. So I think there's a sort of gentle acceptance of each other within India. There are not very many levels, so we don't have a traditional reform but the Chabad was there. They came.
Right, I want to talk about that.
Yeah, so it was always from the outside. It wasn't born of the people. The people amalgamated so well. They became oil pressers. They took on local jobs. They took on the local costume. Their marriage ceremonies were always a mixture of, say, the huppah and the breaking of the glass and some of the prayers, but it was always done with the henna and the flowers. And so it was so close, the growth.
And that's, Rachel, that's, and Aaron and everybody, that's true of Jews everywhere. We assimilate into, the cult. Reform Judaism comes from Germany. It was an assimilation into German culture. Sure. In Britain, where I'm from, in the synagogue, the wardens, as they are called, would sit at the front wearing bowler hats. What Jew wears a bowler hat? A Jew in England, right? And I think, the models of Jewish life, the nature of Jewish life is always very adaptive. I mean, that's how we've survived, right? It's also how we potentially endangered by assimilation to the environments in which we live. And we think it's very hard, I think. It took me time. Rachel grew up with it, but it took me time to get my head around the nature of Indian Jewish life. To understand the nature of that life, we have to understand India, So Rachel mentioned before, a country without anti-Semitism. And my PhD thesis and my academic background was not in film, but actually in anti-Semitic research. And it was like, don't be ridiculous. Everyone hates us everywhere. Such a thing is not possible, right? And the reason why it's possible, and indeed does exist and has happened, and the Mumbai Chabad attack was, of course, something from outside. It wasn't indigenous local anti-Semitism or terrorism, was because India, while it's a multicultural society, albeit a multicultural society under strain at the moment, is a Hindu-dominated culture in the same you and I exist in Christian-dominated societies culturally, even if they're multicultural. And in India, Hinduism, you've got 1,000 gods, so another one, what's the big deal, right?
Right.
That's hardly a threat, right? It's not a challenge to, a trinity. There's no Christianity, of course, is a minor religion in India. So that whole thing about deicide, which has shaped in many respects Western civilization, the Luther Church, etc., doesn't exist in India. And then there's that philosophy in India of Shanti that Rachel can expound upon probably better than me, but about, kind of acceptance and tolerance and openness. That is an ethos in the same way that in Australia, an ethos here would be a fair go for anyone. And so all these things created this environment where Jewish life was very much tolerated, never seen as a threat. And I think that's another unique part of the story. You mentioned something before, Aaron, which was, you know, to understand, much of the film being about Jews in Indian cinema, it's about Indian Jews. And of course, I had to provide that information and that context. And Rachel does that, as do others in the film. And it was one of the big challenges in terms of the filmmaking. And Rachel will know totally what I'm talking about, as will the young lady sitting on her lap, which is where do I put that in the story? And, you know, when you make a film, unfortunately, it's a long, protracted process. It's not like, oh yeah, I want the film to be like that. And then you cut it and it just doesn't flow, doesn't work. You know, and so I had a version of the film where it began with history of, you know, Jews arriving in India. And it was like, nah, right? It's got to start with Bollywood. That's what the film's about. And then where do you place it? And it was not the story, but it's definitely part of the story.
It's definitely part of the story, but the Bollywood aspect of it tells it. And I think it tells it by the fact that the Jewish women could be the actresses because they didn't have to play along the same rules as the Muslims and the Hindus. So it's just, it shows the differentiation. And I'm surprised more people didn't realize that they were Jewish actually originally, because wouldn't there be an outcry from the community if people weren't being modest?
In the Jewish community, well, I think that's the other thing, and Rachel can comment on this from her personal experience. Again, we think Judaism through our Western prism, right? We think Judaism through our Ashkenazi prism, right? But there's a whole Sephardi world out there. And the Islamic world that Sephardi Judaism grew in and existed in, which is not to say it was perfect, aka Spanish Inquisition, aka 1941 pogrom in Baghdad, etc., etc. But it was generally, religiously, a more tolerant and open society. Yes, Jews were dhimmi people with secondary status and all that stuff, but it didn't have the strictures of Catholicism. There was no pope. So Jewish life, Sephardi Jewish life, even today, right, is reflected. You're Sephardi, it's Pesach, you can eat rice. Ashkenazi on Pesach? No, you can't. You're Sephardi, you're Ashkenazi, then you've got to, and you're a religious woman, you've got to have your skirt all the way down to your ankle. You're Sephardi, different proposition. So I think to understand Indian Jewry, we have to understand world Jewry and the difference between Sephardi and Ashkenazi. And yeah, and that was, well, Rachel can speak for herself, you know, as I learned, part of her experience.
Yeah, you know, in retrospect, I wonder whether we were brought up as much more, say, women with a voice, women with options, as opposed to, say, the Hindu or the Muslim. It was very dominated by caste and the strictures of their, you know, their faith, and rather close social views on what women should be and women should not be. I can only speak for my own family, but we were very progressive. There was always an appreciation for the arts. There was always exposure to global, you know, music and dancing and cinema, and books. The books, this is what it is. It's the books. I think we read, we're people that read, and I think there's a certain sort of freedom that you give your children, and it comes through the line that, you know, you learn and you open your eyes. So I wonder whether that could be one of the reasons. I'm not quite sure.
There's a through line there, Rachel, which is, it's not in the documentary, but Nadira, we spoke about her very sad ending. One of the things where she took solace at the end of her life was this phenomenal library she had. And, you know, she just consumed books, philosophy, science, Judaism, you know, global affairs, etc. David Abraham, when he packed up his home in India and moved to Canada, most of the stuff he took was boxes of books. Yeah, I've seen Nadira's book collection, which is being held by the Jewish community in India. I've been to David Abraham's, who was Nagao, by the way, Rachel.
Yes.
Yeah. I've been to his family home in Canada, and in the basement there, they've got all of his books. And when he retired, what did he do? He went and he just reread books, read new books, and took all his books with him. And I think certainly with the Jewish, I mean, if you think about the Jewish playwright, Joseph David Penkar, you know, it was that literacy that Jews had that one has defined us in so much of what we've done in the West, law, medicine, etc. I mean, it has its other reasons. And I think Rachel is spot on. It's clearly I know for a fact that literature and books were a major part of the lives of people like Nadia and David. So, yeah.
Well, it's the knowledge. It's being able to have knowledge and not be ignorant and be able to operate within the world. I mean, do you think that Rachel, do you think that your background with your knowledge and coming to the United States gives you an advantage in many ways?
Yes, yes. I think the language, the fact that I was allowed to, I was given a voice. I was brought up, you know, better than any boy. You know, a very liberated home. So I think that has certainly been a huge help to me in the world. I mean, my work, coming to the U.S., you know, anything. And God bless our community and my parents. And I think, you know, we have no shame, you know, there's no puritanical thinking in our teaching. So I think when you don't, so just going through what these women, they were vamps, they were dressed sexy, they were, you know, sort of sold as, you know, hot items and all the rest of it. But I think in their own minds, everything was good. You know what I mean? When I started modeling, yeah. I was an athlete, and I was one of the first women to get into a swimsuit on a magazine cover. And ooh, my goodness, whoa, that was, you know, a big deal. But I'm glad because I paved the way. I was not a sex symbol. I was like the symbol of health, for example. And so then it became more okay for the next generation and the next generation. And so I think we have been sort of leaders in a way, you know.
It's an openness. It's an openness. And that openness, one, comes from literature, so you're exposed to ideas. But two, being a minority, you know, anywhere, in Melbourne, in New York, in Chicago, in Mumbai, you know, makes you see the world, you know, in a different way. And I think Jews had global connections in India in a way that others didn't. Jews were involved in global trade. The Sassoon family, this very big kind of famous philanthropic family in India. I have a tidbit of information about Ezra Mir, whose real name was, anyway, it was a more Jewish sounding name, just escapes me for the moment. You know, when he went off, he took himself off to America. He was in New York and in Hollywood in the 1920s. He was working with a Jewish producer in the 1920s. Again, it's one of these many stories that never made the documentary. He went then back to India and his community. And there's this kind of exposure and an openness to the global. And there's no doubt that all of that is manifest in several ways, one of which, for want of a better term, is the riskiness that Indian Jewish women took in cinema.
Yeah. What do you think the future is for Indian Jewry and India itself, from from both of your knowledge?
Well, Rachel and I just had a conversation about probably 10 years ago now that we were going to make this great film about great contemporary Indian Jewish story. But she's fluffed it because without giving away the punchline, it was going to be about this one Jew left in Indian cinema, and we've lost our rock. I think, you know, a lot of people ask me that question, and you know, Baghdadi Jews, there's only about 100 left, I think, now in India, and I think all up we're told that there's somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 Jews, mostly in Mumbai. You know, who can, you know, what is that saying? Prophecy is for fools. Yep. So who knows what will be? I think it's fair to say that, you know, the Indian Jewish heyday is over. But, you know, I think its legacy will live on in other ways. It will live on through the fertility that comes through the merging of ideas and experiences. There's a book, I was looking for it, but it's too high up on my bookshelf to show to you, called The Rise and Fall of the Creative Class, which is basically, it is a convergence of ideas that creates new thinking, that creates new innovation, creates new dynamics. And it's an American author, it's a little old now. And that's clearly what happens with Jews in Indian cinema. And I think that will happen with Indian Jews and their legacy and their culture wherever they go. Is there going to be another Indian Jewish superstar? Well, I suppose that's possible. I think it's unlikely. But I think the legacy of Indian Jews, certainly in relation to cinema, which is what I really know about Indian Jews, is one that is, you know, it's there in history. Again, not all of this is in the film. Pramila was the first Miss India, right? No one else can be the first Miss India. Nadira won the Filmfare Awards, Best Supporting Actress, from the equivalent of an Oscar. David did too. Ezra Mir won the Padma Shri, which is this highest award. It would be like the Medal of Honor equivalent in America. And while Sulochana won a Lifetime Achievement Award, a Padma Shri as well, but she also was immortalized she ended up, you know, sad and alone and poor and everything else, but this stamp. So I think the history, if Indian cinema, one of this thing, I'm doing a little bit of work at the moment with a soft power center in Chennai in India. And obviously cinema is a massive part of India's soft power. And, you know, we live in very turbulent political times, China, India, what's going on in America, everything else. India is going to be a major player in the world. Indian cinema is going to be a big part of its soft power. And hopefully in this modest way, my documentary will show that, you know, Jews have played their part in that. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but...
I think it does. But, you know, one thing that we really haven't touched much upon, and I know we are limited on time, but were the attacks on the Mumbai Chabad kind of a momentum shifter in making Jews leave the country? Did that scare the Jewish community? I mean, from seeing it from Chicago, it was terrifying.
Well, I've been to India. I went to India. Was that 2008? I've been to India 3 times, I think, since then for this documentary. And I did not experience anything from any sense of that. And I think the big waves of emigration happened after India's independence, and then in the 1960s, as Rachel said. And I think everyone saw that coming from outside. You know, in the West, we have this thing like Jews and Muslims all were kind of at war with each other, and, you know, anti-Semitism in the form of the boycott movement and Israel and all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of truth to all of that. As Rachel pointed out, for me, as this kind of white Western guy rocking up in India, and my first destination at about 4 a.m, when eventually the driver found the Jewish accommodation in the Magen David synagogue where I was staying, was right next door is a mosque. And it's like, ooh, right? And my, of course, Western assumption is I should be worried. When I went to Konkan, the B'nai Israel villages that Rachel spoke of and which we see in the film, right next to the synagogue there again is a mosque, because Jews and Muslims have so much more in common with each other than with Hindus, respectively. And when I went and I did the filming with Haida in the Magen David synagogue that you see in the documentary, And he starts talking to the caretakers who remember Pramila, and Rachel mentioned this. They're Muslims, yeah? And it's like, it was like this alternative reality that, seriously, that as a white Westerner, took a lot of getting my head around. So from my experience, no, Mumbai was seen as outside, and if anything, while, you know, everywhere in the world is politically unsettled at the moment, you know, the Israel-India relationship is getting stronger and stronger. When Bibi Netanyahu went to India in 2018 on, I think it was the first prime ministerial state visit, they had a Shalom Bollywood event where he was meeting the A-listers of the Bollywood film industry. And Israel and India had just signed a film cooperation agreement. And here we're in good company, because what was shown that night, just clips of the film that they chose to show bits of during the course of the evening, was Shalom Bollywood. So yeah, so I think things will, for the Jews who remain in India, and you know, we're also we're a very kind of itchy feet people, right? We move around. It's not inconceivable to imagine, you know, expatriates taking up, you know, business and other opportunities in India, and so who knows?
You know, one question that a member of the audience has is, you know, we touched upon this. I know we have a few minutes left, but we talked a lot about ageism and sexism that was definitely is and was part of the movie industry. And maybe Rachel, you know this better, but you know, being a woman, I mean, do you think that still exists primarily? Do you feel it? Has the Me Too movement changed some of that in the past few years? I think you're muted.
Yeah, you know, I think it's two different things. The Me Too movement has definitely come into India and has had a big impact and has given us a lot of, you know, stories that need to be told. The ageism, I think, is a very clear part of the business that we're in. It is good and it is rare to have stories about women who are over 50, but it is rare. And generally, I think from way back, from my grandmother's generation to today's world, most people most women phase out, you know, between 40 and 50. They're done. And I think the sad part about that was that generation maybe didn't see that coming. Maybe we're not prepared enough. So when they were hitting their 40s, there was nowhere to go. You know, the funds dried up, the fame went away. My grandmother was lucky, but I don't know how happy she was. She was very isolated in LA. I don't think she, you know, I think she missed that. She missed her world. She missed her party. She missed the joy that is cinema. You know, being in cinema. Yeah. Yeah. So the ageism, I think, is prevalent even up till today, and I think across the world. I mean, in cinema, you know, hopefully that'll change.
You know what I wonder, Rachel, about your grandmother was, it's another one of these many stories that never made the documentary, was, as you know, she was living not far from the Hollywood studios. And there was a film being made with an Indian scene or film. And she used to, apparently, when she arrived in India, in LA, she used to, you know, walk around the block. She had nothing else to do, wearing a sari. You can imagine what that looked like in the 50s, right? Anyway, they had this Indian scene and she got talking to people in the neighborhood. So she was kind of brought in to advise on it. Now, your mum, right, was a superstar in the 40s in India. She would be mobbed, right? Her car would be mobbed, you know. Cynthia told me, like, her memories of that. People scrambling to get her autographs, all of that. And I just wonder, as a slightly older woman, and being an Indian in LA in the 1950s, right? How she would have been treated, like, coming in to advise on saris, you know, just from a sexist, ageist, racist point of view. and how that would have felt to her when she obviously, we know she did miss, you know, the heyday so much. I've often wondered about that.
Well, I can just say, you know, I knew a very small microcosm of the kind of fame and success that she enjoyed, celebrity that she enjoyed. There's a certain syndrome of being an immigrant and going into a foreign country after or at a peak or after you've peaked a career. It's very, very different when you come in as a young person and you work your way up, or you're born in that country. But when you come in and you've had that life and you've had that experience of that life, and you're known and you have a social circle and you have the ability to do anything you want, really. But then you come in and you're in a very, very big disadvantage because nobody knows you, nobody cares to know you. You're known as the foreigner, and they'll ask you the mandatory 3 questions, and then you know, you have nothing really to offer them, so they'll move on. So I can only imagine Grandma, because Grandma was, she was well known for these incredible parties, and she was very social and very well loved by everyone, you know, her family, her staff, her fans. And to come into this very isolated, almost a suburb, I think, of LA, where you can't go anywhere if you don't drive. What do you do in LA if you don't drive, right? So that must have been actually what Danny touched upon, must have been the highlight of her, you know, time there, to be acknowledged as somebody with some kind of expertise. Yeah, it must have been hard.
It must have been. There's another, I don't know if we've got time, Aaron, but another just like little anecdote was something that I've reflected on, was when David went to Canada. Here was, you know, he used to keep the company of prime ministers and presidents, you know. He would be brought out for every visiting dignitary to be the MC in India. You know, he knew all the stars in Hollywood, all that kind of stuff. He hosted, I think it was Fred Astaire or something, on a visit to India. And when he goes to Canada as an older man, he... 2 things. One is living in like kind of, he's not even in a major city. I mean, it's Hamilton is out of Toronto. So one, what a contrast that must be. But 2, he took part in a local Jewish community play. And I think 2 things. Wow, that is incredibly like noble if you've been on the heights of cinema to do that. But obviously it fed his soul. But I just wonder, like, you know, whether for the other people in the cast, you know, this local Jewish community theatrical troupe was, you know, whether they had any idea who this little Indian Jewish man was. And the other thing he used to do was every day, apparently quite religiously, he would get up in the morning, put on his fur coat and hat, get in a bus, go to the local library and write his autobiography. And he never finished that autobiography. Which I have a copy of, and again, like, what a world to go from to. But I think there's a lot of dignity in someone kind of doing that and not thinking that's beneath me, you know. So it's a lot of food for thought.
It is, and it's, I think what it really comes down to is. There's a lot of value in every human, and we have to be able to know, you have to ask the story and learn the story to know who somebody really is. And that's what's so great about this film. And it's a story about these people, and it's a story about community and the Jewish community in general. But I thank you both and everybody here for joining us here tonight, or this morning, tomorrow, on Friday in Australia. But really, it was a pleasure to speak with everybody, and thank you all for being here.
And obviously, if you know, the story goes on, and I post updates of the story on the Shalom Bollywood Facebook page, and either my personal Twitter page or the Shalom Bollywood Twitter page. You know the links on iTunes and Amazon if there's anyone else you think would enjoy it, and appreciate this time travel and being able to go somewhere when we're otherwise locked down.
Thank you, Danny and Rachel. We really appreciate it. Check out jccchicago.org for more great programs. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.